Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we're taking a look at a very unusual Finnish prototype army pistol. Now this is the model of 1944 pistol. Of course there was never a formal adopted 1944 pattern pistol because this never made it out of the prototype phase. Originally this gun was requested because during the Winter War the Finnish Defense Forces had a serious shortage of military pistols. They had adopted the Lahti L35, more commonly seen as the Husqvarna M40, and these were good guns. They were reliable in the cold, which is of course important, but they were relatively complex and very expensive and slow guns to manufacture, and they just couldn't make enough of them quickly enough to supply the Finnish military. So the Finnish Ordnance Department put out an order for a new pistol to be designed, and this was given to a designer by the name of Birger Linkomies. I think I'm probably horribly mispronouncing that name. At any rate, he was a long-serving lieutenant colonel in the Finnish Defense Forces. He was considered one of their primary firearms experts, and he set about designing a new pistol that would be a lot cheaper and faster to manufacture. In February of 1943, the inspector of artillery in the Finnish military authorized the purchase of 5,000 of these pistols, which is surprising given that it wasn't until later in March of 43 that they actually had the blueprints finished for the guns. They were clearly really in a push to get these guns. At this point, we're in the continuation war and they really needed pistols. Well, they ran into some difficulties, namely that every major art factory in Finland that had expertise in manufacturing small arms already had more work than it had time and materials to work with. So there was some problem in allocating resources to make these pistols. And ultimately they assigned the project to VKT, the State Rifle Factory. And when VKT got the blueprints for these, they got together with the designers and they started making a bunch of changes to them in order to make them better guns and more producible guns. And in fact, by the time they finished making a bunch of these changes, it was now September of 43, and the design had changed enough that they redesignated it. It had originally been called the 1943 pattern. It was now called the 1944 pattern. And at this point, VKT finally got started on making the first test production batch of guns. Now, they would do a total of 25, and these guns weren't actually finished and delivered to the Finnish military until November of 1944. And by that point, the continuation war was already over. They'd signed an armistice with Russia, and there really wasn't this dramatic need for pistols anymore. In fact, thanks to elements of the Allied control commissions and the treaties at the end of World War II for the Finns, maybe they weren't really supposed to be working on new guns anyway. So let's take a look at this point at how this thing actually works and how it was designed. And so it's a little bit of a blocky sort of gun, and it is a simple direct blowback 9mm 9x19 parabellum design. Basic set of markings here on the slide. I believe that 9.00 indicates 9mm parabellum. And then of course pistol model 44 made by VKT here. SA is a Finnish Army property mark, and this is serial number 23 of the 25 that were manufactured. Obviously they were intending a production of something up to 10,000 originally. We do also have a much lighter 0023 stamp on the frame there. Now what made this pistol more economical than the L35 is that while the slide was rather finely machined, the frame was actually made out of two pieces of welded together, basically bent heavy gauge sheet metal. Something kind of like a stamping, but more along the Russian style of stampings, something like the PPSH or the PPS, rather than the much finer, thinner metal of German stampings at this time period. There is no manual safety on the gun. It is single action only with an exposed hammer right there. Rather long trigger. Heel magazine release. Pull the mag out, and a total of, I believe, an 8-round magazine, single stack. Mechanically, this is actually very similar to the Spanish/French Ruby pistols, except in 9mm. In fact, some of you will have already noticed the lugs on the barrel there. The barrel doesn't move when you cycle the slide. It's just straight blowback. And in order to disassemble it, we are going to lock the gun open using the manual hold open. It does also lock open on an empty magazine, by the way. Then you can see we have some knurled cutouts in the barrel. We're going to take this and rotate it. See the barrel rotating in there. Rotate it as far as it will go clockwise, and then you can hold this back, push the slide release down, and the slide and barrel assembly comes right off the front. Then we can also pull out the fire control unit. This is a single removable piece like in the Tokarev pistols. We also have the barrel locking lugs and the recoil buffer. We can pull that out. And then we can take the grips off by, let's see, this grip has a little sliding lever that I'm going to reach in and slide, and then this grip comes off. So this thing is the sliding lever. When it's over this way, these two tabs lock onto the frame and hold the grip panel in place. And in this position, the grip panel drops right off. And there is the whole gun field stripped. You may notice I have left the barrel in here. That is because the recoil spring is compressed in between the rear end of the barrel and the front end of the slide here. And that is a rather stiff recoil spring, and I do not want to deal with trying to compress that thing back into the slide there. You can clearly see how it works. It's just a simple barrel. It has locking lugs up in the top here that are rotated into the slide right now that would normally engage in these matching lugs in the frame. That just holds the barrel in position. And then the rest of the slide is pretty typical here. We have a firing pin recessed down in the back. It is spring-loaded. You'll notice, interestingly, there are a couple of wire springs built into the design. So the ejector, or the extractor spring here, is made of wire. And the spring for the slide stop, which is supposed to be nestled in that hole, that's also just a very simple wire spring there. We have this, which is just a recoil buffer to absorb the last bit of energy from the slide opening. That's really important on a blowback gun in 9x19. 9x19 really is kind of the upper limit for pressure and ballistic power for a blowback pistol. And on this one, apparently, even as they were still making the pre-production test series of pistols, they had concerns about whether or not this was really quite fit for service. Apparently, the breech wasn't quite heavy enough on these guns, and it would open a little bit too quickly, and they did sometimes get bulging on the back end of the cases. And firing a large volume of cartridges, they decided, was probably going to be a bad idea, both for the pistol and for the shooter. So had this gone on in service, they would have had to redesign it a bit more. Looking at the frame, you can really obviously see where the weld is on the inside, right there. And we can actually see it a bit. You can see it right there. It's not the cleanest. You know, these weren't apparently made by the Swiss or the Germans. This was kind of a rushed project. This was something they were trying to do with as little expenditure as possible, make them a cost-efficient gun to manufacture. The trigger assembly is a yoke that wraps around the magazine, right there. There is a safety right here under this grip. If that little half-round detent is pushed down, it will push the trigger bar down and out of line with the fire control component, so the gun can't fire unless that is in the upward position. And in the slide, we have a cutout right here at the back. So when the slide's fully closed, that's when this can be all the way upwards and will allow the gun to fire. This unitized fire control group is the same in principle to the Tokarev, but a little different in design. You can see it's got these long wings in the front. But beyond that, a little interesting note, you can see the two punch marks there. Those are hardness testing marks. And that's about all we have going on back here. So at the end of the continuation war, after the armistice with Russia, of course, there was a bunch of negotiation and arms control policies put in place, and the Russians demanded to know basically everything that the Finnish Defense Forces had, and well, the Finns had a bunch of material scattered all over the place, and they did probably their legitimate best in trying to get that information to the Russians, but humorously, rather, when the Russian delegation visited VKT, they happened to spot the batch of 25 of these, having just recently been finished, sitting on a table in the open. And of course, this is a distinctively different pistol, and it hadn't been reported to the Russians because there were 25 guns, and no one really thought to include them in all of these, ordnance listings. And apparently, the Russian delegation kind of blew its stack when they saw this brand new unidentified pistol that the Finns were developing. So they were able to talk the situation down, but that's kind of the last notable hurrah of the M44s. These guns, while they never went any further in production or development, they would stay in Finnish inventory until 1968. At that point, they were dispersed. A number of them went to museums. A number of them went to Finnish military academies, design institutes. And a small number of them were actually sold onto the private market, mostly to officers. And so that is why there are a couple, like this one, that are still available, mostly in Finland, in private hands. So a very cool and very unusual pistol. Hopefully you guys enjoyed watching the video. If you do enjoy seeing this sort of thing on the internet, please do consider checking out my Patreon page. It is support from folks like you at $1 a month or more if you like the perks that are there and available. Anyway, it's your support that makes it possible for me to find these guns and bring them to you. Thanks for watching.